Greetings, everyone. This is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be how to respond to missionaries about oral Torah concerning animals in the Torah. So now I'm going to deal with some Jewish claims about the oral Torah. So you've seen me post this in other videos that the word Torah itself has the meaning of instructions, precepts, things that deal with instruction because the root itself deals with hitting a target, basically like shooting an arrow. And the idea here is that the word Torah, when you look at it, actually comes from the concept of something that's an instruction, or directive, something that, can be oral or written. There's nothing in the word itself that denotes something that's written. And one of the ways we know is that the word Torah is used to describe things before there was even a written text in several situations. And I've talked about that in other videos. So essentially, this is the timeline that you could look at and say of exactly how that works exactly. But I want to get to some other issues in this video. So when we deal with how, we define good sources for Torah Moshe, it has to be something that's ancient, authentic, and authoritative. That's pretty clear, I think, at this point. And we also know that, as I said in other videos, that there are, different Jewish communities that are ancient that agree upon three different elements of the national revelation at Mount Sinai, the creation of the written Torah, 40 years after that happened, and then the sources for the oral Torah that are found in the Talmud as well as the Mishnah, and what things are halakha and oral Torah and what things are not oral Torah specifically from Mount Sinai, but come from other generations. This is something that all of these communities agree upon, and all of them claim that they received oral Torah, their ancestors received oral Torah at Mount Sinai. So essentially, what you would look at in the modern times is that okay, if you look at these different communities and look at them being the majority of Torah-based Jews, and then you find one outlier person who claims that there's no oral Torah, or someone who left the Torah, left Judaism, left the Jewish community, and says, there's no oral Torah, you can look and say, okay, well, the majority of people say that their ancestors received an oral Torah at Mount Sinai, and I would believe the majority of people rather than one guy or person who says that they don't believe in it or whatever. And then, like, if you go back and ask their grandparents, for example, could say, yes, there is an oral Torah, and I received the claim that there was from my grandparents, so on and so on. So let's look at something when it deals with, the idea of, characteristics and names of animals without descriptions in the Torah. So here's an example of the written text of the Torah. When we deal with Deuteronomy, 14:11 to 20, and we see that, one point, Hashem is telling, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the people of Israel, restating something that had been mentioned earlier about what animals are permissible to eat. And one of the things it mentions is this idea of kol mafreset parsa v'shasa'at shasa parasot ma'ale jero behema otham tochalu. So it talks about this. These are the animals that you can eat that have marfeset parsa v'shasa'at shasa parasot ma'alot jero. And then it gets into animals that we are not allowed to eat that don't have these characteristics. But the written Torah never describes what these characteristics even mean. For example, you look and it says, okay, it talks about a pig and it says that it has certain characteristics and then it has certain characteristics that it doesn't have. But then it says, okay, well, then those we can't eat. Well, if this is a Torah requirement, you would have to know up front what exactly this means. Now, there's some people who will claim, well, everybody would have understood that back then. Well, that's not true. If you're not like someone who deals with agriculture, or specifically with like farming, when it deals with animals, you may have no idea what this means. And even in modern Hebrew, there's some people in modern Hebrew, if you were to say this to them, they've had no contact with animals, they may not even know what you're talking about with this. Another idea is a description that's also given in the book of Devarim, and it deals with exactly, a list of animals that are also not permissible to eat. And if you look at it and it says, okay, well, kol sipur. Well, first question says, what is a sipur? What are the ramifications of a sipur? And it says kol sipur tahora tocholu. So all, tahor, like birds you can eat. But then it gives a list of like, of different animals. It says, "Wazeh asher lo tocholu mahem." It says that hanesher v'hapares v'ha'azoniyom. And then it goes through a list of what you see have in red underlines of different types of like if you were flying birds, creatures, or whatever, and says, okay, these we're not allowed to eat, but it gives no physical description of them. Nowhere in the Torah will you find a physical description of all of these like animals that are mentioned in the red. So then that brings up the question: if there's no oral Torah, and this is Torah, and this is considered to like not eating these is a part of the Torah, then the question becomes, well, how would I even know what these animals are? And again, I can't assume that everybody would have known what these are thousands of years ago when there was no internet, which I can use to look them up. There may not have been any zoology books that I could use to look it up. And even in modern times, if you were to ask people about some of these animals, even in modern Hebrew, some people may not know what all of these are, especially if you look at the fact that throughout history, the names may have changed. So there's no guarantee that anybody would have known what all of these animals were, especially thousands of years ago, where they may have had contact with only maybe a few of them. But now the Torah is telling me I can't eat some of them. Well, obviously, the written Torah never describes them physically. It doesn't give me any pictures of any of them, and then it doesn't give me the characteristics which I use to like denote what they are. And there could be a lot of debate about what it is. Someone could say, well, wahat aleph. Okay, well that's this, and someone says, no, no, I was told that hat aleph is this. And what happens? Who determines what is what? So the written Torah gives no description of these animals. And then let's consider the following. Most people understand these things that, these diagrams you see here of what's kosher and what's not kosher. These are the things that are kind of standard to most people. But if you go a little bit further, some people, for example, don't know that moose and giraffe are actually kosher. And one of the reasons is because you don't really have any Jews eating moose or like giraffe because of the fact that they're not animals that you can really domesticate. So consider the following. Okay, when it says the Torah says ma'ale jara, that's one of the characteristics of an animal we can eat. People usually translate that as chewing the cud, but then you could actually ask, what does it mean to chew the cud, even in English? And even who gave you the right to say that in English is a correct terminology? Well, if you know the Hebrew and if you know the oral Torah, it explains that there's a certain way that the teeth are formed and the way that the teeth where the teeth are not in these kind of animals. And if you see like between a cow, a giraffe, and a moose, there's a certain order of how their teeth are. That's what it means, ma'alef jero. So the better way of translating it into English wouldn't be chewing the cud, but more of simply saying that the structure of their mouth and how they eat, for example, because of that structure, is what we look for as a sign of them being a kosher animal. And that's true of all the animals that are considered kosher and that are, this group of animals, for example, of what's called behema. And then you can say, well, mafrasat parso. Well, what does that mean exactly? People say, well, split hoof. But again, who says that that's what it means? When you try to translate it into English, the text itself gives no picture of what that means. And we know that if we look at a cow, this is the kind of hoof that it has. If we look at a giraffe, it has this kind of hoof. And we look at a moose. So this tells us that these are the two signs that let us know for a behemoth, that a giraffe and a moose is just as kosher as a cow. Now, again, the reason why Jews don't eat moose and giraffe is because we can't domesticate them. And one of the reasons about like both of them is we don't have, for example, what's called a masoreth on how to actually do shchita on them. For example, imagine trying to get a giraffe and trying to do shchita on it so you can eat it. I mean, you're looking at something animal that's very tall, very strong, and has like a very long neck. Imagine a moose. Moose are very dangerous. Nobody's raising moose, like domestically. And the things that we eat, generally speaking, we have to have what's called a masoreth on them before we can actually eat them, even if they are kosher. So, in conclusion, as you can see, this is a really easy situation to determine that essentially, when people tell you that there's no oral Torah, this is one of the things I've never seen anyone answer in terms of how do you determine animal species, that don't give any, written Torah gives no physical description of them. And there's no way you can say, well, everybody just knew what it was. You can't even assume that. You have to assume because, nowadays I can look it up on my phone or my computer and I've got Google that I can use. But several hundred years ago, nobody would have had that. They would have had to have known that already. And that's what comes from the oral Torah. And even if someone says, well, it was a grammar issue, that's oral Torah. That's exactly what the definition of oral Torah is. Information that is not in the written text that helps us explain what the written text means and how to do it. So again, this goes back to what I said before. If the majority of Jews, who hold by the Torah and come from ancient Jewish communities that have a long, thousands of years of history going back to Mount Sinai, agree that there's an oral Torah, but then you have one or two guys all of a sudden nowadays who are on their own somewhere or in the minority and things like that, or didn't come from a Jewish background, a Torah-based background and things like that, or, they kind of decided upon themselves, but you find them, they're kind of isolated and they've separated themselves from the Jewish community. You can kind of say, okay, they don't know what they're talking about. They can say anything they want and they're just making something up. So this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.